The purpose of this lecture is to introduce you to the settlement of the Old West. What I want you to do after hearing this lecture is get a sense of who was settling the western part of the United States, why they were migrating to these areas, and what their experience of living in the West was once they were settled in the western part of the United States. First off, I'd like to talk to you about what kind of people you might expect to meet if you were to walk down the street of an old western town. First off, you would not be surprised to meet Native Americans, particularly Native Americans from tribes like the Apache or the Sioux or the Nez Perce. All of these Native Americans had steadily been pushed westward as a result of Anglo-American migration past the Mississippi River. And so these Native American tribes that lived on the plains had lived there for decades, if not centuries, and their primary mode of living was chasing the buffalo. So these were not settled communities, they were rather nomadic tribes that basically followed the buffalo herds. In 1851, these Native Americans signed, a large group of these Native Americans signed a treaty with the U.S. government called the Treaty of Fort Laramie. This treaty guaranteed safe passage for white Americans who were undertaking the journey from Missouri to Oregon, who were traveling the Oregon Trail, and also for those headed to California too as the gold rush heated up. In return for safe passage, Native Americans were guaranteed an annuity, or that is a yearly payment of money or goods. And it was also promised that no more of their hunting grounds would be taken. What you'll find is that after the Civil War ends and more white Americans are lured out west, the Treaty of Fort Laramie will increasingly be disregarded by the American government, and as gold and other resources are found out west, the federal government will intervene more and more to basically dispossess Native Americans of their land. The way that they did this was through targeting the buffalo that was the primary means of support for the Native Americans. In the mid-19th century, there were probably about 12 million buffalo living on the plains, and this was like a walking department store for Native Americans. They used every piece of the buffalo. They used, of course, the meat for food, but then they used the fur for clothing. The teeth and other bones were used in jewelry. By targeting the buffalo, they were basically ensuring that the Plains Indians' way of life would have to come to an end. So in 1850, there were about 12 million buffalo living on the plains. By 1890, as a direct result of western migration on the part of white Americans, there were less than 1,000 buffalo living on the plains. So this forced Native Americans living out west to basically adopt Anglo-American traditions and to assimilate themselves, or to at least try to assimilate themselves into white American society. The federal government attempted to assimilate the Indians in 1887 by passing a piece of legislation known as the Dawes Act. That's D-A-W-E-S, the Dawes Act in 1887. This introduced the concept of private property for Native Americans, and it basically created the reservation system that is in place today. It basically gave land to specific tribes and then divided that land into private allotments that were given to various families. It depended upon the nuclear family, the idea of the mother and father and children living together. And it was not that great of a success, mainly because most of the land that was given to Native Americans was not very good land. For reasons that we'll talk about, a lot of the best land went to railroad companies out west. So they were not given the best land. And also the idea of living on private property was foreign. It was a foreign concept to Native Americans. So while the Dawes Act was may have been filled with good intentions, it actually culturally devastated Native American tribes. Land out west under the control of Native Americans went from 138 million acres prior to the Dawes Act to about 48 million acres after the Dawes Act. And as I said, most of the land was of an inferior quality and not suitable for agricultural production. And so that will ensure that Native Americans have a very rough time assimilating to the changes that they are faced with in the West. Another group of people that you might see if you're walking down a street in the Old West are a group of African Americans that historians refer to as exodusters. These are African Americans who fled the South in the aftermath of Reconstruction as Southern state governments began to reassert their control over their own affairs when Reconstruction collapsed in 1877. Some African Americans chose to migrate westward rather than to remain under the domain of white Southerners. They are called exodusters, of course, after the story of the Exodus in the Bible. From about 1860 to 1900, in that 40-year period at the end of the 19th century, more than 500,000 African Americans fled the South and settled out west. The African Americans that you're seeing here in this photograph are citizens of a town called Nicodemus, Kansas, which was a planned community of former slaves who migrated from Kentucky. So these slaves migrated from Kentucky, found land in Kansas, renamed it Nicodemus, and its population peaked in about 1880 at about 700. Nicodemus, Kansas today is a historic site. It's kind of a ghost town. No one lives there. But it is an example of African Americans moving out west and attempting to assert some sort of control over their own lives, free of the interference of white Southerners in the South. Another group of African Americans who moved out west were the so-called Buffalo Soldiers. These were African American soldiers who fought in the Federal Army against Native Americans as tensions flared up between Native Americans and the federal government. Several or many thousand African American soldiers went out west. More than 25,000 African Americans served as Buffalo Soldiers, and about 18 of them won the Congressional Medal of Honor as a result of their service. So you have two different strains of migration for African Americans. Some Southern African Americans are coming to get away from the repressive regimes in the South, and some African American men are taking advantage of serving in the military and serving as Buffalo Soldiers against Native Americans. Another group that you would expect to see on the towns, on the streets of the cities of the Old West are the Chinese and other Asian immigrants. Especially if you were in California, you would expect to come into contact with people of Asian descent. They were present in California as early as the 1840s. They participated in the gold rush of 1849 by crossing the Pacific Ocean. Their numbers were 25,000 by 1852. So just a couple of years after the gold rush, about 25,000 Chinese were to be found in California and along the western coast of the United States. Many of these Asian immigrants faced very tough discrimination, kind of similar to the discrimination that African Americans faced in the South at the time. For example, the mines of the West that were so lucrative, many people of Chinese descent were forbidden from working in these mines or from benefiting from these mines. An example of this is in 1862, California passed the Anti-Coolie Act, which basically placed a special tax on Asian mine workers. So if you were a mine owner and you wanted to hire an Asian worker, you had to pay a large tax that you wouldn't have to pay if you hired a white worker to do the same job. So they were not allowed to participate in one of the most lucrative businesses of the Old West. But as you can see in this picture here, what this guy is doing is participating in building the railroads that basically made the West economically viable. About 90% of the workforce that built the railroads going out west were composed of Asian American workers, particularly Chinese workers. So they literally built the infrastructure that would make the West economically successful, but they themselves, in things like the Anti-Coolie Act, they themselves were discriminated against. Also, keep in mind that the 14th Amendment applied to people born in the United States. So this is a group of people who are coming to the United States who are not given citizenship. And the first Congress that met in 1790 had defined citizenship as belonging to free white men. So Chinese people of Chinese descent who came to the United States were excluded totally from citizenship. They could not be naturalized citizens, and the 14th Amendment only covered people born here, so it did not apply to Asian immigrants. In 1882, all of this discrimination culminated in the Chinese Exclusion Act. This act basically stopped all Chinese immigration to the United States. And in the last half of the 19th century, you'll actually see a decline of Chinese immigrants living in the West. In 1880, there were about 105,000 Chinese people living in the West. By 1900, there were less than 90,000. And those numbers will continue to decline until this ban is lifted in the early 20th century. So these are three groups that you would expect to see: Native Americans, African Americans, or the Exodusters, or Chinese American immigrants. These are three groups that you would expect to see if you were walking the streets of the Old West. By the mid-19th century, many white Americans ascribed to the ideal of manifest destiny, which was the idea that it was the special privilege and that it was a God-given right for white Americans to spread American civilization from one coast of North America to the other. That white Americans would, and that the United States would ultimately possess all of the land between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. Now, many white Americans came to the West in search of better opportunities, better farmland. Many were lured by mining, which we'll talk about in just a second. In 1862, Congress passed a piece of legislation known as the Homestead Act. What this legislation did was it promised Americans who moved out west 160 acres of land. All you had to do to receive this 160 acres of land was live on it for 5 years. Once you could prove that you had lived on it for 5 years, then the land would be granted to you free and outright, and you would receive title to this land. You're seeing in this picture here one white American who took up the federal government's offer of free land out west. But many of these Americans who move out west will have a very difficult time of making a success. A lot of that has to do with the fact that the Plains states are very different from the southeastern and midwestern states. You're seeing here in this picture in the background a sod house. Many of them had to build houses literally out of dirt because on the plains there were no trees for timber to make houses out of. Also, even though the government was giving away free land, you still had to have farm implements and farm tools to be successful, and you also had to have a family to be successful as well. Historians estimate that even with the free land, you still needed about $2,000 cash in order to be able to go out west and set up a farm and start being successful. Many Americans underestimated that. They went out west, they built their houses out of dirt, and they found the climates to be unsuitable for growing certain types of crops. And also, in the last part of the 19th century, there were a series of very serious droughts that basically ensured that even those who showed up with their $2,000 cash and got their free land would not be a success. Also, the best land out west went to the railroad companies. The United States government did not have the money to build the railroads out west, and so what they did was grant land to the railroad companies, and the railroad companies used that land to sell it off and basically use the profits of it to build the railroads. So what I'm getting at is that basically the Homestead Act basically gives the land that is left over after the railroad corporations are given the land that they receive in order to build the railroads. Many thousands of white Americans migrated out west, but a very famous and popular phrase in the late 19th century was, "In God we trusted, but in Kansas we busted." In other words, for many Americans who wanted to move out to the plains and establish a new life for themselves, that life, that dream of prosperity and of wealth simply just did not come true for many of them because of the hardships that they faced. Many of you are probably familiar with the idea of the mining west. In other words, of going out west to find gold and to strike it rich quick. This is, of course, because of the legacy and the historical myths surrounding the gold rush of 1849. So as early as 1849, Americans knew of the possibility of abundant riches out west. And so there were a group of Americans who came out west simply for the purpose of mining and not setting up farms and going into the farm or agricultural business. Many Americans did move out west to prospect or to mine for gold. Now, we tend to think of the West as being a place that was very rich in gold, and in certain segments of it, it was. But what you're seeing in the background here is a picture of Virginia City, Nevada in the late 19th century. Nevada was heavily rich in silver or deposits. So basically, there was way more silver that was mined out west than gold. In 1877 alone, more than $21 million worth of silver was produced in Nevada. That is in 1877 dollars. That would be the equivalent of about $400 million today. So an enormous sum of money was being produced in silver. You'll want to keep that in mind because eventually silver will come to have very serious political consequences in the later half of the 19th century that we'll talk about at another time. Now, you may have the idea of men moving out west and prospecting for gold by themselves, and that did occur. But most of the people who worked in the mining industry were people like you see in this photograph here. They were people who worked for large mining corporations because in order to get to those silver deposits that were buried deep in the earth, it took a process known as hydraulic mining, which was basically blasting away these mountainsides with large amounts of water. Now, there will be serious environmental consequences to that, but for our purposes, what I want you to know is that it took an enormous amount of capital to be able to go out west and establish a mining company. And so it was really large corporations that were benefiting the most from the material and the natural resources of the West, and not the prospectors that you might be more familiar with. There's one more group that I'll talk about that you would expect to meet on the streets of the Old West, and that is, of course, the cowboys and the ranchers. Now, we have this idea that the Old West was dominated by these cowboys, and our idea of this basically comes from the westerns that were very popular in the United States that Hollywood produced in the 1950s. Of course, that is a very romanticized idea about who the cowboys actually were. Cattle and ranching was a big business that boomed in the late 19th century, and so cowboys did exist. But it was an extremely poorly paid job. Hours were long, work was often seasonal and uncertain, and it was not a way that most people wanted to make a living. Now, we tend to think of cowboys as being all white, and that's a legacy of Hollywood because you rarely saw in the 1950s anything other than a white cowboy. But actually, about 25% of cowboys were Hispanic, as you see in this picture here, and another 25% were African American, and the other half were white Americans. The reason for this is because this was one of the only occupations outside of farming that was open to people of Hispanic or African American descent, because the pay was so low and no one really wanted to do this type of work. And so cowboys were actually a very, very racially diverse group of people. The heyday of the cowboy was between about 1880 and 1900, a 20-year period in the later half of the 19th century. They were basically engaging in these very large cattle drives south, or actually northward from Texas to Abilene, Kansas, where the railroad was. And they would get the cattle up to Abilene, Kansas, and then they would pack them onto train cars and send them back to Chicago, which had become the meat packing capital of the United States. This came to an end around 1900 because the meat packing industry began to spread to other large cities, and also large industrialized farms eventually came to replace smaller farms and smaller operations. And the cowboy way of life died out. But they did exist, and they were there, and I did want to acknowledge that you would likely come into contact with them if you were to walk the streets of the Old West. It's just that they would also, there was a good chance that they would be a very diverse group, and they might not look the way that you would expect them to look if you're basing your knowledge of them off of Hollywood's history. This is where I will end this lecture, just giving you an overview of the types of people who came out west and why they came and what their experience was.